On the morning of August 30, 1916, 22 men stood on a black, frozen beach at the edge of the world. Their clothes were torn. Their faces were hollow. Some were so weak that standing had become an act of will. Behind them was a shelter built from 2 overturned lifeboats, scraps of canvas, stones, and frozen earth. In front of them stretched an ice-choked sea that seemed to lead nowhere. They had been trapped on Elephant Island for more than 4 months. No ship normally came this way. No nation knew exactly where they were. And the man who had promised to save them had disappeared into the most violent ocean on Earth in a boat barely larger than a modern family car. By then, some of the men had begun to believe Ernest Shackleton was dead. Then a shape appeared through the mist. At first, it looked like another shadow among the ice. Then came smoke. A mast. A small steel vessel pushing toward the beach. The men rushed to the shoreline. Someone waved a coat. Others shouted until their voices broke. On the approaching ship stood Shackleton. He had crossed an ocean in an open boat. He had climbed over the unmapped mountains of South Georgia. He had survived repeated failed rescue attempts. And now, after everything Antarctica had done to stop him, he had come back. Shackleton raised his binoculars and counted the figures on the beach. 1 man. Then another. Then another. 22. Every man he had left behind was alive. But this rescue was only the final impossible moment in a chain of disasters that had begun almost 2 years earlier. A chain that included a ship crushed like a wooden box, hundreds of days trapped inside moving ice, hunger, frostbite, collapsing camps, 3 lifeboats thrown into a freezing sea, and one of the greatest small boat voyages ever attempted. Shackleton had set out to conquer Antarctica. He never even reached the shore where his great march was supposed to begin. His expedition failed before the first step. Yet that failure became more famous than many victories. Because when the map became useless, the ship disappeared, and every original goal was gone, Shackleton chose a new mission. Bring every man home. Ernest Shackleton was born in Ireland in 1874 and went to sea while still a teenager. He was not a scientist, and he was not the most technically gifted navigator of his generation. What he possessed was something harder to measure: enormous ambition, physical courage, emotional intelligence, and an almost dangerous ability to persuade people to follow him into uncertainty. Antarctica had already tested him before the Endurance Expedition. In 1901, he joined Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery Expedition. The journey introduced him to the brutal reality of polar travel, but illness forced him to return home early. Shackleton never forgot the humiliation. He came back in 1907 as leader of his own expedition aboard the Nimrod. With 3 companions, he marched farther south than anyone had before. They reached a point only 97 geographical miles from the South Pole. Then Shackleton turned back. The decision may have saved their lives. Their food was running low. Their bodies were failing. Continuing might have won glory, but it could also have killed them all. When he returned, Shackleton was celebrated as a hero and knighted. But in 1911, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole. Robert Falcon Scott arrived later and died with his companions on the return journey. The great race to the pole was over. Shackleton needed a new objective. He called it the last great journey of Antarctic exploration, the first crossing of the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole. It was a plan of extraordinary scale. One party would sail south aboard Endurance, establish a base near the Weddell Sea, and begin the crossing. Another group, the Ross Sea Party, would approach from the opposite side aboard Aurora and lay supply depots across the final portion of the route. If everything worked, Shackleton and a small team would travel roughly 1,800 miles across the coldest continent on Earth. But Antarctica did not care about the plan. Endurance was a wooden, 3-masted ship built for polar waters. Her hull was thick, her timbers strong, and her name seemed almost prophetic. Shackleton gathered sailors, officers, doctors, scientists, mechanics, dog handlers, a photographer, and a carpenter. Among them were men whose skills would later become the difference between survival and death. Frank Worsley, the captain, had an extraordinary instinct for navigation. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, was calm, loyal, and trusted by the crew. Tom Crean, an Irish seaman and veteran of earlier Antarctic expeditions, possessed almost unbelievable endurance. Harry McNish, the carpenter, could build and repair with whatever material remained. Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer, carried heavy cameras and fragile glass negatives into a world that seemed designed to destroy them. There was also Perce Blackborough, a young Welsh sailor who had been rejected from the expedition and then smuggled himself aboard as a stowaway. When Blackborough was discovered, Shackleton warned him that on starving expeditions, stowaways were traditionally the first to be eaten. Then he added him to the crew. The expedition left Britain in August 1914, just as Europe was falling into the First World War. Shackleton reportedly offered his ship and men to the British government. He was told to continue. While armies mobilized across Europe, Endurance sailed south. The ship crossed the Atlantic, stopped at Buenos Aires, and then continued to South Georgia, a mountainous island where Norwegian whaling stations stood along the coast. The whalers understood the Weddell Sea. They warned Shackleton that the ice was unusually heavy. The sensible decision might have been to wait. But every expedition had a narrow seasonal window. Delay could destroy funding, momentum, and perhaps the entire project. Shackleton chose to continue. On December 5, 1914, Endurance left South Georgia. 2 days later, the ship encountered pack ice. At first, it seemed like an obstacle that patience and careful steering could overcome. The crew searched for channels of open water between the floes. Endurance pushed through leads, reversed, turned, and forced her way south. But the deeper they traveled, the more the ice closed around them. The Weddell Sea is not simply water covered by a motionless frozen surface. Its ice moves under the pressure of wind and current. Floes rotate, collide, separate, and compress. A channel that exists in the morning can vanish by evening. The ship was entering a vast machine made of frozen ocean. On January 18, 1915, a northerly wind pressed the pack together. The open water disappeared. Endurance stopped. The crew tried sawing and cutting the ice. Men worked with picks and shovels. The engines were used when even the smallest channel appeared. Nothing worked. The ship was held fast. They were close to the Antarctic coast, but not close enough. The landing point from which the crossing was supposed to begin remained beyond their reach. For days, the crew expected the pressure to ease. Then days became weeks. Endurance drifted with the ice. Shackleton understood what this meant before many of the others did. The expedition might lose the entire Antarctic summer. If the ship did not break free soon, winter would trap them in darkness. The crossing was already slipping away. Yet the men still had a ship. They had food, fuel, dogs, equipment, books, music, and each other. Endurance became a small wooden world floating inside the ice. Shackleton imposed routine. The dogs were exercised. Scientific observations continued. The crew played football on the frozen sea. Meals were served at regular times. Birthdays were celebrated. Frank Hurley photographed the ship beneath the strange Antarctic light. The photographs would later become some of the most haunting images in the history of exploration. Endurance appears frozen in darkness, her masts rising against the night while bright lamps shine through the rigging. In other images, the ship leans under pressure, looking less like a machine and more like an animal slowly being trapped. Shackleton knew that boredom and fear could destroy discipline long before hunger did. He watched personalities carefully. He rearranged living quarters so that potential sources of conflict remained close to him. He shared hardships and avoided isolating himself behind rank. He tried to ensure that the crew saw confidence even when he privately feared the worst. The sun disappeared for the winter. Darkness settled over the Weddell Sea. Temperatures fell. The ship groaned at night. Ice pressed against the hull, released, and pressed again. Sometimes the pressure lifted Endurance out of the water. At other times the floes opened beneath her and then closed with terrifying force. The men could hear the wood complaining. Months passed. The expedition's official objective was now impossible. Even if Endurance escaped, the season for crossing the continent had been lost. Shackleton quietly changed the purpose of the expedition. The goal was no longer achievement. It was survival. When the sun finally returned, it did not bring rescue. Instead, the ice became more violent. In October 1915, immense pressure waves moved through the pack. Floes buckled and climbed over one another. Ridges rose around the ship. The hull twisted under forces no carpenter could repair. Water began entering. The pumps ran continuously. Men carried coal, stores, clothing, food, tents, sleeping bags, and equipment onto the ice. They moved the lifeboats away from the ship. On October 27, Shackleton gave the order he had resisted for months. Abandon ship. The men climbed down from Endurance and stood on the frozen sea. For 281 days, the ship had been their home. Now it was dying. Shackleton told the men that the ship and stores were gone, and they were going home. It was a simple sentence. But no one knew where home was. They were stranded on moving ice hundreds of miles from safety. There was no radio powerful enough to summon rescue. No aircraft could reach them. No search party knew their exact position. They had 3 lifeboats, limited food, and the equipment they could carry. Their first instinct was to march. Shackleton hoped they could drag the boats across the ice toward open water or land. But each boat weighed heavily even before supplies were added. The surface was broken by ridges, cracks, pools, and soft snow. The men hauled ropes until their bodies shook. Progress was almost meaningless. After days of exhaustion, they had moved only a few miles. Shackleton stopped the march. Continuing would consume their strength and food while leaving them trapped in the same frozen wilderness. They established ocean camp on a large floe. Then they waited. On November 21, the remains of Endurance finally disappeared beneath the Weddell Sea. Frank Worsley watched as the stern rose and the ship sank into dark water. The men had lost more than timber and machinery. They had lost the last symbol of the organized world. No ship meant no shelter, no engine, no return route, and no proof that rescue could come. Now they lived in tents on drifting ice. They melted snow for water and hunted seals and penguins when possible. Their clothing became damp and filthy. Sleeping bags froze. Smoke from blubber stoves blackened faces and tents. The dogs that had once been essential to the crossing consumed food the men could no longer spare. The decision was made to kill them. The expedition's cat, Mrs. Chippy, was also shot. For the crew, these were not small losses. The animals had been companions through months of darkness. Their deaths made one truth impossible to ignore. There would be no return to the original plan. Only humans and lifeboats remained. The floe drifted north, but not in a straight line. Some days it carried them toward possible safety. Other days wind and current pushed them backward. They could do nothing but calculate, ration, maintain equipment, and wait for the ice to break. Shackleton sometimes walked alone at the edge of camp, studying the horizon. He carried the burden of every decision. Food saved today might be needed months later. A march could bring freedom or destroy the weakest men. Remaining on the floe could preserve strength or allow the ice to carry them into open ocean. There was no safe choice. In late December, Shackleton tried another march. Once again, the broken surface defeated them. Men sank into snow. Sledges overturned. The boats became nearly impossible to drag. After roughly a week, they had gained little. They stopped and established a new camp. They called it Patience Camp. The name described the strategy perfectly. Wait for the ice to carry them north. Wait for open water. Wait without knowing whether the floe beneath them would split during the night. For months, the men existed between solid ice and open sea. Cracks appeared near tents. The sound of moving floes traveled through the darkness. At times, part of the camp had to be moved quickly before the ice separated. Food became more uncertain. Some men weakened. Others grew irritable or withdrawn. Shackleton believed morale was a survival resource. He encouraged games, conversation, and routine. He controlled portions carefully. He tried to prevent the men from thinking too far ahead. The future was too large and too frightening. The next meal, the next watch, the next safe night, those were manageable. By March 1916, the floe was breaking apart. The men could see more open water between the ice. Their prison was weakening, but freedom brought a new danger. If the floe shattered before they launched, men and supplies could disappear into the sea. On April 9, after nearly 6 months living on the ice, Shackleton ordered the boats launched. 28 men crowded into the James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills. The Weddell Sea met them with freezing spray, heavy swells, drifting ice, and almost no chance to rest. The boats were open. Water entered constantly. Men bailed while others rowed or handled sails. Their clothing froze stiff. Their hands lost feeling. They could not simply head toward the nearest point on a map. Wind, current, and ice forced them to change direction. Captain Worsley fought to determine their position whenever the clouds allowed a glimpse of the sun. Several destinations were considered. Then Elephant Island became the best hope. It was barren, mountainous, and uninhabited. But it was land. After days of exposure, even a black rock rising from the Southern Ocean looked like salvation. On April 14, the island appeared. Reaching it was another battle. Wind and current pushed against the boats. Men who had survived more than a year without touching land now faced the possibility of being swept past it. They rowed and sailed through exhaustion. On April 15, the boats reached a narrow beach. Perce Blackborough, the young stowaway, was suffering badly from frostbite. Shackleton arranged for him to be carried ashore first. Blackborough became the first of the Endurance party to stand on land after 497 days at sea and on the drifting ice. The men collapsed, laughed, ate, and drank fresh water. For a few hours, Elephant Island felt like rescue. Then they studied the place more carefully. The first beach was exposed to falling ice and dangerous tides. The party moved to a more secure location that they named Cape Wild, after Frank Wild. There, they built a shelter by turning 2 lifeboats upside down on stone walls and covering gaps with canvas. The structure was dark, wet, crowded, and filled with smoke. But it might keep them alive. The greater problem was location. Elephant Island was far from normal shipping routes. No one had any reason to visit it. The outside world did not know the men had reached it. Waiting could mean death. Shackleton studied the map. The nearest realistic source of help was South Georgia, more than 800 miles away across some of the most dangerous ocean on Earth. The route crossed the Southern Ocean toward the region sailors feared for its enormous waves and violent storms. The only available vessel was a 22-foot lifeboat. Choosing to sail seemed insane. Remaining seemed worse. Shackleton selected the James Caird, the largest and strongest of the 3 boats. Harry McNish, the carpenter, strengthened it. He raised the sides, built a deck from timber and canvas, sealed gaps with paint and seal blood, and helped turn a lifeboat into something that might survive an ocean. The work was rough because the materials were rough. There was no shipyard. There was only a freezing beach and the remains of a failed expedition. 6 men would go. Shackleton. Frank Worsley, whose navigation would determine whether they found an island hidden in an immense ocean. Tom Crean, whose strength and loyalty were beyond question. Harry McNish, whose repairs might keep the boat afloat. John Vincent, a powerful sailor. And Timothy McCarthy, an experienced seaman. Frank Wild would remain in command of the 22 men on Elephant Island. Before leaving, Shackleton gave Wild instructions for what to do if he never returned. It was a possibility neither man needed to explain. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird pushed away from Elephant Island. The men on the beach watched until the boat disappeared. For those remaining, Shackleton had taken their best chance of rescue with him. For the 6 aboard the boat, there was no safe return. The James Caird entered the open ocean. Almost immediately, the scale of the task became clear. 6 men, food, water, ballast, sleeping bags, tools, and equipment were packed into a space barely large enough to move. 3 men worked while 3 attempted to rest beneath the small deck. Rest was almost impossible. Water leaked in. Spray froze on clothing and rigging. The boat rolled violently. Bodies slammed against timber. The men rotated through steering, handling sails, and bailing. If they stopped bailing, they could sink. If they lost control of the sails, they could capsize. If Worsley miscalculated their position, they could sail past South Georgia and enter thousands of miles of empty ocean. Navigation depended on a sextant, a chronometer, and rare glimpses of the sun. The boat pitched so violently that Worsley sometimes had only seconds to brace himself and take a sight. A small error at the beginning could become dozens of miles by the end. South Georgia was a tiny target. Missing it meant death. The cold became relentless. Water entered the sleeping bags and froze. The men developed saltwater sores. Their hands cracked. Their faces swelled. Vincent weakened badly. McNish suffered. Shackleton watched every man, adjusted watches, and tried to preserve the strongest without making the weakest feel abandoned. Their drinking water became foul. The ice they carried melted and absorbed salt. Thirst tormented them even while freezing water washed across the deck. Then the ocean showed them what it could do. During one storm, Shackleton saw what he thought was a break in the clouds. It was not a cloud. It was the white crest of an enormous wave. The James Caird climbed and fell through seas that could have destroyed a much larger vessel. The men bailed desperately as freezing water filled the boat. Ice formed on the deck and rigging, making the boat dangerously heavy. They hacked it away while the ocean struck them from every side. Day followed day. There was no horizon, only gray water, gray sky, and the possibility of death beneath both. Yet Worsley continued calculating. Shackleton continued projecting belief. And the James Caird continued east. After more than 2 weeks, signs appeared. Seaweed. Birds. Then, on May 10, through rain and broken cloud, they saw the mountains of South Georgia. They had found the island. The navigation was almost beyond belief. But the ordeal was not over. A hurricane prevented them from landing safely. They were close enough to see land and still in danger of dying against its rocks. The men fought the storm for another night. At last, they entered King Haakon Bay on the uninhabited southern coast. They pulled the James Caird onto shore. For the first time since leaving Elephant Island, they stood on solid land. They drank fresh water. They ate. They rested. But the whaling stations were on the opposite side of the island. The James Caird was damaged, and several men were too weak to continue by sea. Between Shackleton and help stood the unexplored interior of South Georgia, a wall of mountains, glaciers, ridges, and snowfields. No one had crossed it before. Shackleton chose Worsley and Crean to go with him. McNish, Vincent, and McCarthy would remain beside the overturned boat at what they called Peggotty Camp. The 3 walkers had no tent, no sleeping bags, no map of the interior, and almost no mountaineering equipment. They pushed screws into the soles of their boots for grip. Then they began climbing. The mountains of South Georgia rose steeply from the sea. Clouds hid peaks and distorted distance. Glaciers blocked direct routes. More than once, the men climbed high only to discover that the valley ahead ended in an impassable drop. They had to turn back and search again. Time mattered. The men on Elephant Island were waiting. The three at Peggotty Camp needed help. And Shackleton knew that exhaustion would become more dangerous if they stopped for too long. They moved through the night. At one point, they reached a steep slope in darkness. Descending slowly might take too long. Waiting could mean freezing. Shackleton made a decision. The three men sat together and slid down the mountain. They could not see what waited below. The slope might have ended in a cliff. Instead, they fell into deep snow and survived. They rose and continued. After roughly 36 hours of near-continuous movement, they heard a sound that did not belong to wind, ice, or animals. A whistle from the Stromness whaling station. It was the first sound made by people outside their expedition that they had heard in 17 months. They descended toward the station. The three men looked almost inhuman. Their hair was long and matted. Their clothes were torn and stained. Their faces were blackened by smoke and exposure. Workers stared as they approached. Shackleton asked to see the station manager, Thorolf Sorel, a man who had known him before the expedition. When Shackleton entered, Sorel did not recognize him. Then Shackleton identified himself. The station manager understood. The Endurance Expedition, missing for so long, had returned from the dead. There was no time for celebration. Shackleton immediately arranged a boat to rescue McNish, Vincent, and McCarthy from the other side of South Georgia. All 6 men of the James Caird party were now safe. But 22 remained on Elephant Island. Shackleton began organizing a rescue almost at once. The first ship, Southern Sky, sailed south only days after he reached Stromness. Pack ice stopped it. A second attempt was made with a vessel supplied by Uruguay. Ice stopped that ship too. A third attempt, aboard the schooner Emma, also failed. Each failure was torture. Shackleton knew the condition of the men he had left behind. He knew their food, shelter, and health were deteriorating. He knew that winter storms could destroy Cape Wild. He also knew they had no way of learning that he had reached South Georgia. On Elephant Island, Frank Wild maintained discipline. Each morning, he reportedly encouraged the men to prepare as though rescue might arrive that day. The shelter beneath the overturned boats became a world of darkness, smoke, hunger, and waiting. The men hunted seals and penguins when they could. Food was often greasy and monotonous. Their sleeping space was cramped. Clothing remained wet. Tempers tightened. One of the most serious cases was Perce Blackborough. Frostbite had destroyed tissue in his toes. The doctors concluded that surgery was necessary. Inside the primitive shelter, using the limited medical supplies they had saved, the expedition surgeons amputated his damaged toes. The operation succeeded. But every passing week weakened the group. Some men kept faith in Shackleton. Others began to doubt. The ocean remained empty. Finally, the Chilean government provided Yelcho, a small steam tug commanded by Captain Luis Pardo. Yelcho was not an icebreaker. It lacked the equipment of a polar exploration ship. But it was available. On August 25, 1916, Pardo and Shackleton sailed south. As they approached Elephant Island 5 days later, fog and ice threatened to block them again. Then the weather opened. The island appeared. On shore, the men were preparing a meal when someone saw the ship. At first, they could not believe it. Then they recognized Shackleton. He called toward the beach, asking whether they were all well. Frank Wild answered that they were all well. Every man. The evacuation began immediately. Yelcho could not remain safely near the ice-covered coast. Small boats carried the survivors away from Cape Wild. Within about an hour, the beach that had held them for more than 4 months was empty. No member of the Endurance party had died. The result was extraordinary, but it should not hide the cost. The men returned with damaged bodies and memories that would remain with them. Some went almost directly into military service during the First World War. The wider Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was not without loss. On the opposite side of the continent, the Ross Sea Party had endured its own disaster while laying supply depots for a crossing that never began. 3 members of that group died. Shackleton's original objective failed completely. He did not cross Antarctica. He did not establish the planned base. Endurance never landed its expedition on the continent. Measured only by its stated goal, the expedition was a defeat. But history rarely remembers it that way. It remembers what happened after the plan collapsed. Shackleton's leadership was not perfect. He made risky decisions. He could be impulsive. Some of his relationships with crew members became difficult, especially with McNish after disputes on the ice. Yet when disaster came, Shackleton understood something essential. A leader's first responsibility was no longer the dream that had brought them south. It was the people who had trusted him. He watched morale as carefully as food. He placed the most difficult personalities near himself. He distributed hope even when he could not guarantee survival. He changed plans when reality proved them impossible. He turned back when pride demanded progress. And when rescue failed once, twice, and 3 times, he tried again. The story also belongs to the men around him. To Frank Worsley, who found South Georgia with a sextant from a boat thrown across the Southern Ocean. To Tom Crean, who crossed mountains after surviving the James Caird. To Frank Wild, who kept 22 men alive through 4 months of darkness and uncertainty. To Harry McNish, whose carpentry transformed a lifeboat into an ocean-going vessel. To Frank Hurley, whose photographs allowed later generations to see Endurance frozen in the night. To Captain Luis Pardo and the crew of Yelcho, who entered dangerous waters to bring the stranded men home. And to every sailor, scientist, doctor, cook, mechanic, and dog handler who endured hunger, cold, fear, and the collapse of everything they had expected. Years later, Shackleton returned to South Georgia on another expedition. On January 5, 1922, he died aboard the ship Quest at Grytviken. He was 47 years old. At the request of his wife, he was buried on South Georgia, the island whose mountains he had crossed to save his men. Endurance remained beneath the Weddell Sea for more than a century. But the ship's name never disappeared. Because Endurance was no longer simply the name painted across a wooden stern. It had become the meaning of the story. Not victory without failure. Not courage without fear. But the ability to continue after the original dream is gone. Shackleton sailed south to become the first man to cross Antarctica. Instead, he became famous for something he had never planned to do. He lost his ship. He lost his expedition. He lost the achievement that was supposed to define his life. But when 27 men needed him more than history did, he chose them. And against the ice, the ocean, the mountains, and every reasonable expectation, he brought them home.